Gravity of U.S. by Clara Marigold. Chapter 1, The First Descent. The engines of the spacecraft hummed softly, a steady vibration that was more familiar than comforting to Astrid King. She had been piloting craft for years, sightseeing shuttles, research vessels, military transports. But today, her mission was different. She wasn't just flying through the stars, she was heading toward a moon barely on the map. A barren, low-gravity rock called Veritas 4. Ready for descent, Captain King, came a voice from behind her, smooth and almost too calm. Dr. Leo Hale's tone had that slightly dismissive edge she'd come to expect from the astrophysicist. "Just keeping my eyes on the instruments, Dr. Hale," Astrid replied, fingers dancing over the control panel. She could already feel the tension creeping into her shoulders. No one had warned her about how unpredictable things could get when you were dealing with low gravity. She didn't mind flying near planets or asteroids with heavy atmospheres, but the moon was a different beast altogether. Light, treacherous, and filled with sudden gravitational shifts. She glanced into the rearview mirror where Leo was seated, his face buried in a tablet, fiddling with data that only he understood. His lanky figure was draped in the white jumpsuit of a scientist, a far cry from her own rugged flight suit. They had little in common. He was reserved, soft-spoken, and entirely uninterested in taking risks. She, on the other hand, was known for living on the edge. It was no surprise to anyone that they had been paired together for this mission. "I hope your calculations are correct," Astrid said, more to herself than him. Leo looked up from his tablet, eyebrows slightly furrowed. "My calculations are always correct. If they weren't, I wouldn't be here." She shot him a side eye but didn't respond. Leo had the kind of calm confidence that irked her. Maybe it was because it was a confidence born of intelligence, something she lacked, or so she felt. Leo was brilliant. He had a mind for astrophysics that could chart the entire known universe in minutes. But Astrid had always preferred to take the wheel, the reins, the control. That was her thing. Initiating descent in 3, 2, 1, she muttered under her breath, the words as much for herself as for the computer systems. The sudden drop in gravitational pull felt almost like a tug, a slow pull downward as the ship descended through the thin atmosphere of Veritas 4. She couldn't help but chuckle as they both shifted weightlessly in their seats. This was the moment she was waiting for, when everything changed, when gravity no longer ruled. "Well, this is fun," she said, her voice tinged with amusement as she felt her body slowly float free in the cockpit. It was like being in a dream, or maybe a video game. Leo, on the other hand, was adjusting the straps on his seat as if the low gravity might cause some unseen disaster. He wasn't nearly as comfortable with the sensation as she was. Astrid smirked, watching him struggle. "You sure you're okay with this? It's a little different from the safety of your lab, isn't it?" Leo shot her a glare, one that couldn't quite hide the slight flush rising to his neck. "I'm fine," he said, his voice tight. "Just not used to this kind of environment." "Low gravity can be fun once you get the hang of it," Astrid teased. "Maybe if you loosen up, you'll start enjoying yourself." She felt a sharp jolt, and for a moment, she had to fight the urge to reach out and stabilize herself. The ship hit a rough patch in the atmosphere, a patch of turbulence that sent them tumbling. Even in low gravity, the forces of nature were still at play. Astrid immediately pulled the controls, steadying the craft just before they began to drift too far. "That wasn't part of the plan," she muttered, her heart racing for a few beats. The last thing she wanted was to crash this ship, especially not when Leo was counting on her to get them down in one piece. Leo held on to his seat, eyes wide but focused. "Is this supposed to happen?" he asked, his voice just a little shaky. Astrid's lips quirked into a wry smile. "Oh, it's not supposed to happen. But it does. Welcome to the thrill of spaceflight." Leo grumbled, obviously not enjoying the lack of control. "Maybe next time, we could just take a shuttle. With gravity. Preferably with a much larger margin for error." She just laughed and kept the ship steady as it finally glided toward the moon's surface. The rocky terrain below was scattered with jagged cliffs and barren craters, a desolate landscape that looked more like something out of a bad science fiction novel than an actual place. As the landing gear came into place, Astrid allowed herself a sigh of relief. They had made it. "Barely." "We're here," she said, flicking off the descent controls. "Let's get you and your precious instruments to work." But Leo didn't immediately respond. He was staring out the viewport, lost in thought, his fingers tapping gently on the edge of his seat. "Something on your mind, Doctor?" she asked, giving him a sideways glance. Leo turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever think about what's beyond the science of all of this? The bigger picture, I mean." She blinked at him. "I'm not exactly a philosopher. I'm more of a get-the-job-done type." "I figured," he said with a small smirk. "Still, there's something poetic about this place, don't you think? It's so lonely. So far from everything. Just us, this ship, and the moon." Astrid paused for a second, her hand hovering over the hatch control. He had a point. She didn't exactly believe in fate or destiny, but there was something oddly romantic about being stranded on a moon like this with no one around to bother them. No distractions. Just the vast, endless expanse of space. "Sure," she replied, with a grin that didn't quite mask her curiosity. "Poetic. But first, let's get your equipment set up before this place drives you crazy." Leo smirked but didn't argue. They both knew this was going to be an adventure, one neither of them had planned on. Little did they know, the adventure was only just beginning. And it was going to take them places neither of them ever imagined. Chapter 2, Gravitational Pull. The surface of Veritas 4 was desolate. Stark. A bleak expanse of gray dust and jagged rocks stretched out for miles, bathed in the cold light of a distant sun. Astrid stood by the airlock, watching as Leo set up his equipment, muttering calculations to himself under his breath. The low gravity made every movement feel like it was happening in slow motion, almost dreamlike. Even the smallest jump sent her floating a few inches above the ground. It was an odd sensation, but one she had grown used to over the years. Leo, on the other hand, was having more trouble adjusting. He gripped his tablet as though it were the only tether keeping him from floating away entirely, his eyes darting between the readings and the rocks around them. "I'm not sure about this," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "This moon is, more unstable than we anticipated. The seismic readings, Astrid shot him a look, trying not to roll her eyes. You say that like you expected it to be a luxury resort. He raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. You're not taking this seriously, are you? Not everything in space has to be a life-or-death situation, she replied with a smirk. We're here to get your data. We do the job, we go home. Leo took a deep breath and adjusted the small, portable station he'd set up on the rocky ground. I'm here to collect data on the gravitational anomalies of Veritas 4. If we succeed, this could change everything about our understanding of low-gravity environments. Astrid walked over to the equipment, her boots crunching against the rocky surface as she lowered herself into a crouch beside him. You're serious about this, huh? Leo shot her a look that was both defensive and exasperated. Of course I'm serious. This moon's gravity is unstable, unpredictable. We don't even know why it behaves the way it does. If we figure that out, it could have major implications for deep space exploration. She raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. And that's why you had to drag me all the way out here. Don't pretend you're not enjoying it, he shot back, his lips curling into a small, teasing smile. You wouldn't have come if you didn't think it was interesting, too. She chuckled, unable to hide the grin that crept up on her face. You've got a point. But let's be clear, Dr. Hale, I came for the paycheck, not the space science lectures. He let out a laugh, a sound that seemed completely out of place in the quiet emptiness of the moon's surface. Fair enough. As they worked, the silence between them was oddly comfortable, punctuated only by the hum of their equipment and the occasional click of tools. In the low gravity, every movement seemed deliberate, slow. She found herself gliding across the surface rather than walking, every step lighter than air. It felt freeing, exhilarating even. For the first time in a while, she allowed herself to relax into the rhythm of the work. Despite the oddness of their partnership, something about it felt right. There was a sense of camaraderie in the way they moved around each other, cooperating without really having to talk too much. And though Leo still seemed a little stiff, like he wasn't fully accustomed to the unpredictability of space travel, there was something in his demeanor that made her think he might just be starting to enjoy himself. Ready to head out to the coordinates, she asked, snapping him out of his reverie. Leo nodded, packing up the last of his equipment and securing the data pads. Yes, but I'm not sure we'll get accurate readings from the current location. I want to see if we can find a better spot to set up the station. Astrid gave him a sideways glance, raising an eyebrow. You're not worried about being too far from the ship? He shrugged, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. Not if we stay within a reasonable distance. The gravity here is unpredictable, but we can manage. The real risk is getting too close to the fault lines. That's why I want to be careful. She pursed her lips, considering it. She knew she couldn't keep dragging her feet. Leo had been right so far. The anomaly on Veritas 4 was something no one had fully understood yet. The data they were gathering could potentially unlock the secrets of low-gravity environments, something that could change space travel forever. She had to admit, it intrigued her. Lead the way, Dr. Hale, she said, settling her helmet over her head and securing it tightly. He gave her a nod, a fleeting smile crossing his face before he turned to lead the way. Astrid followed, her boots floating lightly across the uneven terrain as she trailed behind him. There was something about the way he moved, careful, measured, that reminded her of a person trying to avoid a mistake. A person who couldn't afford to let anything go wrong. It was endearing, in its own way. As they made their way to the designated coordinates, the gravity of the situation, both figuratively and literally, began to settle in. The moon's gravity fluctuated in ways that Astrid hadn't anticipated. Every step she took felt like it might be her last, as though at any moment, the ground beneath her could give way. After a few minutes of walking, floating, really, they arrived at the location Leo had marked. The terrain here was rockier, more jagged. There was a deep crack in the ground where the seismic readings had spiked earlier. "This is the spot," Leo said, eyes scanning the horizon. He sounded confident, even though Astrid could see the tension still lingering in his shoulders. He set down his equipment carefully, kneeling down to begin calibration. Astrid watched him for a moment, then glanced up at the sky. The stars seemed so far away, so unreachable. The stillness of the moon was almost suffocating. She couldn't help but feel the weight of isolation pressing down on her chest. It was as if they were the last two people alive in the universe, stranded on a cold rock in the void. "How do you deal with it?" she asked suddenly, her voice low. Leo didn't look up from his work, but his response was thoughtful. "Deal with what?" "The loneliness. The silence. Space can be a lot to handle. I mean, we're on a moon in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing." He paused for a beat, then gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I suppose you get used to it. Or maybe you just learn to embrace it." There was something in his voice that made her pause. Something vulnerable, even though he didn't seem like the type to share much of himself. "Yeah," she said softly, "I guess you do." And for a moment, neither of them spoke. They just worked in the silence of the moon, letting it wash over them. But in that silence, something shifted. Something more than just the quiet gravity of Veritas 4. Something that neither of them was ready to face. Chapter 3: The Attraction of Gravity. Astrid stared out at the barren landscape before her, her boots light against the surface of Veritas 4. The deep crack they'd arrived at earlier had revealed an array of strange readings, indicating some kind of tectonic activity beneath the surface. It was an anomaly no one had predicted, and yet, here it was, an enigma that demanded answers. She adjusted her visor, tapping at the interface on the side of her helmet. Data began streaming in, readings of gravitational waves and seismic activity, each more bizarre than the last. She'd been in enough strange places in her time to know when things were truly unpredictable, and this was definitely one of those times. "Are you seeing this?" Leo's voice crackled over her comm, pulling her from her thoughts. "Yeah, I see it," she responded, scanning the rocky horizon. "This isn't normal. Whatever's happening beneath the surface, it's not just low gravity. It feels unstable." There was a moment of silence on the comm, then Leo's voice again, tinged with urgency. "We need to be careful. These fluctuations could get worse. Let's move the equipment closer to the fault line, it might give us a clearer picture." Astrid felt a mix of apprehension and curiosity stir in her chest. Part of her wanted to say no, wanted to walk away before something went wrong, but the other part, her thirst for answers, for discovery, urged her forward. She glanced at Leo, who was already adjusting his pack and prepping his equipment, the look on his face one of quiet determination. "All right," she said, pushing off from the ground and floating toward him. "But we keep the communications open. If things go sideways, we need a backup plan." Leo nodded without looking up, his attention focused on the small device in his hand, a gravimeter that would help them track the changes in gravity. His expression was serious, and for a moment, Astrid wondered just how much danger they were really in. It was clear that Leo was determined to get the data they needed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about science to him. There was something else behind his actions, something that made her feel like she was following him down a path she didn't entirely understand. They worked in silence for the next few minutes, moving closer to the fault line, their bodies floating just above the surface. The landscape around them seemed almost surreal, with jagged rock formations protruding from the dusty ground and strange shadows stretching out behind them. In the low gravity, every movement felt exaggerated, as if time itself was bending around them. It was easy to lose track of where they were, easy to lose yourself in the quiet beauty of it all. When they reached their new location, Leo set down his equipment carefully and began calibrating the gravimeter. Astrid, meanwhile, pulled out her own scanner, trying to get a sense of the gravitational flux in the area. It wasn't just the moon's low gravity that was affecting them, it was something deeper, something beneath the surface that was causing these erratic shifts. "This is weird," she muttered, glancing at the readouts. "It's like the gravity's not just fluctuating in intensity. It's shifting. Oscillating between different levels." Leo looked over at her, his eyes narrowing behind his visor. "That's exactly what I'm seeing. It's almost as if the entire moon is breathing." The words hung in the air between them for a moment, and for the first time since they'd arrived, Astrid felt a chill run down her spine. The moon, breathing. It was a bizarre thought, one she couldn't quite wrap her mind around. Still, the data was clear, there was something deeply unusual happening here, something they needed to understand before it got worse. A sudden rumble beneath their feet jolted her out of her thoughts. The ground shuddered, a deep vibration rippling through the air. It was a tremor, nothing catastrophic, but unsettling enough to make her heart race. She glanced over at Leo, who was staring intently at his screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. "That's not normal," he muttered under his breath, tapping at his tablet. "There's definitely something active down there." Before she could respond, another tremor shook the ground, this time stronger, more pronounced. The air around them seemed to hum, the low-frequency sound vibrating in her chest. "Get back to the ship," Leo ordered, his voice sharper now. "This isn't just a seismic event. Something's triggering these fluctuations." Astrid nodded, her instincts kicking in. She didn't need to be told twice. With one last glance at the rocky expanse around them, she pushed off from the surface and began floating back toward the airlock, Leo right behind her. Her mind raced with possibilities. A tectonic shift. A fault line that had never been mapped. Or something far worse. Something that they were on the verge of discovering, and maybe too late. They didn't make it far. The next tremor hit with such force that it knocked them both off course. Astrid found herself floating sideways, her body drifting toward a jagged rock formation that loomed menacingly in the distance. She reached out instinctively, her gloved hand brushing the surface of the rock to steady herself. The low gravity made everything feel like it was in slow motion, but it also meant she had little control over her movements. She could hear Leo's voice in her calm, his tone tinged with panic. "Astrid! Get back here!" But before she could respond, the ground beneath them seemed to collapse, pulling them both down into a newly formed chasm. Astrid's stomach lurched as she felt herself falling, her body weightless for a brief moment before she crashed into the walls of the newly formed crevasse. Her helmet hit the rock with a jarring thud, and for a moment, everything went black. When she came to, she was lying on the ground, the sharp edges of the rock digging into her suit. Her comm was buzzing with static, and it took her a moment to remember where she was. The low gravity made her head spin, but as her vision cleared, she realized she was still alive. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw Leo lying nearby, his body sprawled awkwardly on the ground. He wasn't moving. "Astrid! Astrid!" His voice crackled through her calm, weak but there. "You all right?" She pushed herself up, her gloved hands scrabbling against the rocky surface as she floated toward him. "Leo! You okay?" He groaned as he sat up, looking a little dazed but otherwise unharmed. "I think I've had better days." She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "You scared me there for a second." He gave her a half-smile, the kind that made her heart flutter for reasons she wasn't ready to admit. "You and me both." The chasm they'd fallen into was deep, its walls too sheer to climb. But as the gravity fluctuations continued around them, Astrid realized they were in more danger than they'd thought. Whatever was happening on Veritas 4 was far from over, and they were trapped in the heart of it. They had no choice now but to face whatever the moon had in store for them together. Astrid glanced at Leo, feeling the weight of their situation settle between them. Neither of them had expected to end up here, stranded in a dangerous crevasse, surrounded by an unstable environment. And yet, here they were, relying on each other for survival. As the tremors continued to shake the ground, she knew they had no way out but forward, and maybe, just maybe, whatever happened next, they'd face it together. Chapter 4: The Pull of the Unknown. The jagged walls of the crevasse loomed above them, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in the low gravity. Astrid and Leo were silent for a moment, both catching their breath and assessing their surroundings. The tremors hadn't let up, though they were less intense now, almost as if the moon itself was breathing, exhaling slowly in a series of deep vibrations that echoed through the rock. Astrid's mind raced. The data they had gathered before the ground gave way had been startling. But now, cut off from their ship, they had nothing but their wits, their training, and a growing sense of unease to guide them through this. "Do you think this is some kind of seismic event?" Astrid asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Leo was inspecting his gravimeter, his brow furrowed as he analyzed the readings. "It doesn't seem like any fault line I've ever seen," he replied, more to himself than to her. "I mean, these fluctuations, this kind of irregularity, doesn't make sense. It's like the entire gravitational field of the moon is in flux. Whatever's beneath us, it's not just geological. It's different." The low gravity allowed them both to drift a few feet off the ground as they moved toward the edge of the chasm, scanning the walls for any signs of life or clues about what was happening below. Their bodies floated with ease, the lack of weight making every movement feel almost dreamlike, as if they were in a constant state of weightless suspension. Astrid pushed off the surface, gliding toward a nearby rock formation. Her gloved hand brushed the rough surface, and she stared at the stone, wondering if there was something more to this strange phenomenon. There had been no signs of alien life on Veritas 4. No history of such anomalies either. They were far from any known settlements, and yet, something was changing here. Something was alive. "Do you feel that?" she asked suddenly, her voice tinged with a sense of realization. "Like something's watching us?" Leo turned, his eyes meeting hers across the chasm. There was something in the air, something invisible and heavy that seemed to tug at them both, a magnetic force drawing them in, pulling them closer. It wasn't just the tremors. There was an almost palpable sense of presence in the air, a strange tension that neither of them could explain. That he didn't answer at first, his expression thoughtful, but then he nodded slowly. "Yeah. I've been feeling it too. It's almost like the moon is trying to communicate with us." Astrid blinked. "You think it's alive?" "I don't know," Leo admitted, shaking his head. "But it sure feels like it. These fluctuations, this movement beneath the surface, it's not natural. It's like something's orchestrating it." They fell silent, both lost in thought. The more they uncovered, the deeper the mystery seemed to become. If there was life beneath the surface of Veritas 4, what was it? And why had it remained hidden all this time? Without warning, the ground beneath them trembled again, the vibrations growing stronger this time. The strange magnetic pull seemed to increase as well, as if the moon itself was reaching out, trying to draw them in. Astrid's heart raced as she pushed off from the rock she had been leaning against. Something was changing, and whatever it was about to make itself known. "Leo," she called, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to get back to the ship. This is escalating. Whatever's down there, it's not waiting any longer." Leo didn't argue. He simply nodded and started to move in the direction of the airlock. But as they made their way toward the ship, the ground shook once more, this time with such force that it sent them both spiraling into the air, their bodies weightless, disoriented. They tumbled helplessly, unable to control their movements in the zero-gravity environment. Astrid reached out, grabbing hold of a nearby rock to steady herself, but the pull of the moon was too strong. It was as if the very atmosphere around them had shifted, distorting gravity in unpredictable ways. Every movement was exaggerated, like floating through water, and the longer they remained suspended in the air, the more disoriented they became. Finally, with a desperate lunge, Astrid managed to catch hold of a sturdy rock outcropping. She gritted her teeth as she steadied herself, heart pounding in her chest. Leo was close behind her, his hand gripping a different rock formation as he floated beside her. "What the hell just happened?" he gasped, his face pale beneath his helmet. "I don't know," Astrid replied, her voice tight. "But I think it's trying to pull us down." They exchanged a look, both realizing the same thing at once. Whatever was happening beneath the surface wasn't just a natural disaster, it was something far more deliberate. And it was actively trying to draw them closer. "We need to go now," Astrid said, her voice grim. "Before whatever this is gets worse." But just as they started to push off toward the airlock again, the ground shook once more, even stronger than before. This time, the gravitational field of the moon flickered, briefly oscillating between low and high gravity, before everything went still. Then, as if in response to their fear, a deep rumbling sound erupted from the very core of the moon, a sound so low and resonant that it seemed to vibrate in their chests. It was a warning. A call, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the gravity shifted again. Only this time, it was different. With a final, heart-stopping jolt, Astrid and Leo were pulled from the rock formation they had been clinging to. They were hurled through the air, their bodies weightless once more, but this time, there was nowhere to land. They were being pulled towards something far deeper than the surface. Something that had been lying dormant for millions of years. A force that neither of them could understand. Astrid's eyes met Leo's as they spiraled in the low gravity, their hearts racing in unison. She didn't know what was going to happen next. But one thing was clear: the moon was alive, and it was pulling them closer to its heart. They were no longer just explorers. They were part of something much larger. Chapter 5: Uncharted Territory. The tug of the moon's strange gravity had forced them into an uncontrolled freefall, dragging them further into the heart of Veritas 4. The twisting, erratic motion of their bodies made every moment feel like an eternity. Astrid's breath caught in her throat as she spun helplessly through the dark expanse, the cold lunar surface distant above them. Despite the lack of weight, every jarring pull of the unseen force sent jolts through her, a mixture of disorientation and mounting dread. "Leo," she called, her voice frantic as she desperately reached for him in the vastness of the low-gravity expanse. There was no time to think, no time to prepare. She grabbed at his wrist, her fingers grazing the metal of his suit, finally securing a grip. "I've got you." Leo's voice was strained as he steadied himself, his helmet pointed toward hers, his eyes wide with urgency. "Astrid, we need to figure out what's going on before this thing rips us apart." A deafening crack sounded in the distance, an explosive sound that echoed through the chamber, followed by a low, continuous rumble. The moon trembled again, but this time, the ground beneath them shuddered violently, as if the core itself was waking up from a long slumber. "Do you hear that?" Leo asked, gripping her arm tightly as the pull of gravity shifted once more, sending them hurtling toward a jagged formation of rock protruding from the surface. "I do," Astrid said, her voice tense. "It's coming from below us, deep inside. Something is down there, and it's causing these fluctuations." Leo didn't respond immediately, his attention focused on the readings from his suit. The gravitational field, it's not just fluctuating. It's completely erratic. It's almost like something's disrupting the moon's natural rotation. They were spiraling closer to the rocky formation, but instead of aiming to land gently, they were falling faster than they had expected. A flash of panic shot through Astrid's chest as she realized how little time they had. With the momentum carrying them forward, she pushed off from the rock they had been drifting towards, forcing herself and Leo into a controlled dive, trying to navigate through the weightless expanse. "Grab hold," Astrid shouted. They were headed straight for a massive cliffside that looked like it could tear apart the suit's outer layer if they collided at the wrong angle. Leo's hand shot out, catching her arm with a strong grip. Together, They managed to steer their bodies at an angle, avoiding the sharp edges of the rock. They drifted, gliding together in a slow, spiraling descent toward a larger plateau, the uneven ground coming closer with every second. They landed in an uncoordinated tumble, bouncing across the surface before coming to a hard stop, their helmets skidding across the dust-covered ground. They both lay motionless for a moment, their breath heavy and ragged inside their suits. "Damn," Leo muttered, sitting up first and offering a hand to Astrid. "This isn't going as planned." She took his hand, shaking her head slightly. "You think? This entire mission is a disaster waiting to happen." They were silent for a moment, the dust around them settling in the low gravity. The tremors had stopped, but the uneasy feeling in the air persisted, a subtle hum that seemed to vibrate in their bones. "Okay," Astrid said, her voice firm, "we need to find the source of these anomalies. Whatever's happening down here is not natural, and we're getting closer to it every second." Leo glanced around. "Any ideas where to start?" "I think we need to go deeper," she said, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the landscape. "The seismic readings are coming from beneath this plateau. If we can get to the core, we might find the answers we're looking for." "I'm not sure answers are what we're going to find down there," Leo said, his voice low. "This isn't just a natural disaster. It feels like something is alive." Astrid nodded. The gravity around them fluctuated once again, not enough to throw them off balance, but enough to remind them of the volatile environment. There was no telling what they were about to encounter, but she knew they had no choice but to press on. "Whatever it is," Astrid said, determination in her voice, "we're going to find out." They began to move, carefully picking their way across the rocky surface. The plateau ahead appeared to be a solid formation of smooth stone, with large cracks running along the edges like veins. Astrid's eyes caught a faint glow in the distance, an eerie, pulsating light that seemed to beckon them forward. "Is that?" Leo's voice trailed off as they both stopped in their tracks, staring toward the glow. "Not sure," Astrid replied. "But we're going to find out." The light pulsed again, growing brighter with each beat. It wasn't just the reflection of their suits or a trick of their eyes. This was something real, something foreign. They quickened their pace, their movements more purposeful now, though still careful. Every step felt like they were being drawn into something deeper, something beyond their understanding. As they drew closer to the light, the ground beneath their feet vibrated once more, but this time, the intensity of the pull was different. It was subtle, almost like a gentle tug, guiding them toward the source of the anomaly. When they finally reached the source of the light, they were faced with an imposing stone structure, its surface smooth and metallic, yet its edges were so intricately carved they almost seemed organic. A pulse of energy radiated from within, and they could feel the hum of it deep in their bones. "What the hell is this?" Leo muttered, reaching out to touch the surface. As his fingers brushed against the stone, a shock of energy ran up his arm, and he jerked back. "I don't know," Astrid said, her voice tight with both fear and awe. "But I think we've found the heart of this moon." The moon was alive, and it was calling them. They exchanged a glance. Astrid didn't know what they were about to uncover, but one thing was certain: whatever lay ahead would change everything. They were no longer just explorers. They were about to become part of the mystery that had been buried beneath the surface of Veritas 4 for centuries, and there was no turning back now. Chapter 6: The Heart of the Moon. Astrid's fingers hovered near the strange, glowing stone before she took a deep breath and pressed her hand fully against its surface. The moment she did, a ripple of energy coursed through her, and the low hum in the air intensified, vibrating through her entire body. She could feel it in her chest, a pulsating rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. "Are you sure about this?" Leo's voice cut through her concentration, tinged with unease. "I mean, this place, it's not normal. We have no idea what's inside." "I'm sure," Astrid replied, her voice steady, though the uncertainty gnawing at her insides told a different story. "We don't have a choice. The answers are in here." The stone beneath her palm rippled, almost like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. The light surrounding them pulsed brighter, casting elongated shadows across the plateau. For a moment, everything seemed to still as if the very air was holding its breath. Without warning, the ground trembled. Astrid's legs buckled slightly under the sudden force, and Leo grabbed her arm to steady her. The stone before them began to move, splitting down the center with a grinding sound that echoed across the barren landscape. "Whoa," Leo muttered under his breath. That's not supposed to happen." A wide opening appeared in the stone, and an eerie, violet glow radiated from the newly revealed chamber within. It was an entrance, dark and inviting, but it felt like a trap, a magnetic pull drawing them inside. "We're going in," Astrid said, her voice a mixture of determination and awe. The adventurer within her was pushing her forward, but the scientist part of her, quiet, rational, was whispering warnings. She could ignore the doubt for now. There was too much at stake. Leo didn't argue. He nodded, tightening the grip on his suit's harness before stepping toward the opening. Astrid followed him, her breath shallow as she crossed the threshold. The air inside was dense, charged with energy that clung to the skin. The temperature was cooler than the surface, but it wasn't cold, more like an unnatural chill, one that settled deep within her bones. The walls of the cavern were sleek, metallic, and glowing faintly with the same violet hue they had seen earlier. "Well, this is something," Leo said, his voice echoing in the chamber. His footsteps were muted against the thick dust beneath them. "I don't know if I'm more impressed or terrified." "Both, I think," Astrid muttered. "Stay alert." They moved forward in silence, the soft thrum of the chamber vibrating beneath their feet. As they ventured deeper into the heart of the moon, the air seemed to grow heavier, and with each step, the atmosphere pressed in around them. The walls now appeared to be covered in an intricate web of symbols, too complex and alien to decipher. It looked like a mixture of ancient carvings and modern technology, as if this place had been designed by beings far beyond their understanding. Then, ahead of them, something shifted, a sudden flicker in the violet light. A shape materialized at the far end of the cavern, tall and imposing, its form indistinct at first. But as they drew closer, it became clear, a towering figure, humanoid in shape, but entirely made of the same glowing stone that surrounded them. "Is that?" Leo's voice trailed off, his eyes wide. "Not sure," Astrid replied, her voice low. "But we need to find out." The figure stood motionless, its eyes, or what appeared to be eyes, glowing with an otherworldly intensity. It wasn't a statue. It was something more. Something alive. Suddenly, the figure's arms moved, and the ground vibrated once again, a low rumbling that seemed to come from deep within the moon itself. A sound, a whisper, almost imperceptible, filled the air, but it wasn't a voice. It was a hum, a frequency that reverberated in their minds, bypassing their ears altogether. Astrid froze. "Did you hear that?" Leo nodded slowly. "It's in my head." "What the hell is that?" The whisper grew louder, more distinct, as if the entity was trying to communicate. The walls of the chamber began to shift, the symbols moving in response to the vibration. Astrid's chest tightened as the realization hit her: whatever was here, whatever they had uncovered, was not meant to be disturbed. But it was too late to turn back now. The figure's hands raised, and for a moment, the violet light grew blinding. Astrid shielded her eyes, heart racing. She had no idea what was happening, but the answer was coming. She could feel it. The whisper stopped, everything fell silent, and then the ground beneath them cracked open, a deep chasm splitting down the center of the cavern. Astrid and Leo stumbled back, narrowly avoiding being swallowed by the yawning abyss. The floor groaned, shifting as the light dimmed and then exploded outward, casting shadows against the jagged walls. Astrid's eyes widened. "This is it," she breathed, feeling the weight of her words. "This is why the gravity's been fluctuating. It's all connected to this place." Before she could say another word, the entity moved again, its glowing form bending toward them. Astrid's heart skipped a beat as the figure's voice, now clear and distinct, echoed in her mind. You are the ones who have awakened us," the voice intoned. "We are the heart of Veritas 4. The disruption you feel is not a result of your presence. It is a consequence of our return." Astrid's mouth went dry. "Return?" The figure nodded, its voice a fusion of ancient wisdom and timeless sorrow. "We were the guardians of this moon. Our existence, tied to the heart of Veritas, has been dormant for eons. Now you have disturbed it. And you will bear witness to the consequences." "What consequences?" Leo demanded, his voice sharp. "We're not here to destroy anything. We just want to understand." The figure's eyes, if they could be called eyes, focused on Leo. "Understanding comes at a price. You must decide, now, whether you will embrace your role in the moon's fate or turn away and face the consequences of ignorance." Astrid exchanged a look with Leo. The choice was theirs, and neither of them knew what the right answer was. But there was no going back now. "We're listening," Astrid said, her voice steady despite the rising tide of fear. "Tell us what we need to do." The figure's form shifted, as if considering. Then, with a motion almost too fluid to follow, it extended a hand toward them. "You must help us." Chapter 7: The Weight of Decisions. The glowing figure's outstretched hand hovered in the space before them, shimmering with an ethereal light that felt almost tangible. The air seemed to hold its breath, vibrating with a hum that pulsed from the very core of the moon itself. Astrid could feel it deep within her chest, that strange sensation of being both grounded and weightless all at once. Leo was the first to speak, his voice hesitant but sharp. "Help you? How? We don't even know who or what you are." The figure's luminous eyes, or what passed for eyes, shifted, a subtle, eerie motion that seemed to reach into their very souls. We are the keepers of Veritas IV, a race long forgotten. We are the balance. Without us, this moon will fall into chaos, and its power will destroy the very system that sustains it. You, humans, have awakened us, and now you must decide whether you wish to save this place, or let it collapse into the void. Astrid's mind raced, her fingers twitching with the weight of the decision hanging before them. The magnitude of it was almost too much to process. She had spent her life studying celestial bodies, mapping constellations, but none of that could have prepared her for this. Standing before an ancient being, a guardian of the moon, with the fate of everything resting on her and Leo's shoulders, it felt surreal. "What do you mean by help?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The figure's body seemed to ripple, its form shifting fluidly as if it were made of liquid light. "The disturbance you feel is not just a consequence of your presence," it continued, its voice resonating within their minds, heavy with a mix of urgency and sorrow. "The power of this moon has been misaligned for centuries, since we were locked away. The balance that kept the gravitational forces in check, the cycle of energy, it has been broken. We need you to restore it, to realign the power of Veritas with the energy source at its core." "And how do we do that?" Leo asked, his tone skeptical but intrigued. "Through the heart," the figure said, gesturing toward the glowing crystal at the center of the cavern. "The heart of Veritas lies deep beneath the surface of the moon. But to reach it, you must pass through the trials." "Trials?" Astrid echoed, her voice rising with disbelief. "What kind of trials?" "Tests of endurance," the figure intoned. "Tests of your will, your trust in each other, and your ability to sacrifice for the greater good. Only those who are worthy can reach the heart. If you succeed, the balance will be restored. If you fail, Veritas will fall, and all of its energy will be lost, irretrievably." Astrid exchanged a look with Leo. The weight of the decision was pressing in on them from all sides. They had come to this moon seeking answers, seeking a solution to the gravity anomalies that had disrupted their mission. They had no idea that they would be standing in the presence of an ancient race, facing a cosmic test that could determine the fate of an entire celestial body. "Why us?" Astrid asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you choose us?" The figure's eyes flickered. "You did not choose this, but you have been chosen. The moment you arrived, the alignment of the stars shifted. Your fates are bound to this moon, to Veritas. The energy within you, your choices, your emotions, your will, is the key. You may not understand, but the moon responds to your presence, to the conflict within you. That is why you are the ones who can restore the balance." Leo let out a short, incredulous laugh. "So, we're the chosen ones now, huh? Great. Just what I always wanted." Astrid shot him a glare, but the tension in her chest wouldn't ease. Leo's sarcasm, though familiar, did little to mask the growing anxiety that gnawed at her insides. "I don't think we have much choice here," she said softly, her eyes meeting Leo's. "We can't just walk away. If we don't do this, everything we've worked for, everything this mission stands for, it all falls apart." Leo hesitated, clearly struggling with the same burden of responsibility. His usual cocky demeanor had faded, replaced by something far more serious. Finally, he sighed. "I'm not one to back down from a challenge," he said, looking toward the glowing stone figure. "So, what's the first step?" The figure nodded, a gesture that felt almost like a confirmation. "You must enter the trials. They will begin at dawn. You will face them together. Only by trusting each other and understanding your place in the greater web of existence will you succeed." "And what happens if we fail?" Astrid asked, dreading the answer. "Failure means destruction," the figure replied simply. "But you will not fail if your hearts and minds are aligned. Now go. The path to the trials begins beyond the cavern. When you are ready, step forward, and the trials will begin." With that, the figure withdrew, its form dissolving into the surrounding light, leaving Astrid and Leo standing alone in the cavern. The air seemed to thicken, and the ground beneath their feet felt more unstable, as though the moon itself was anticipating the trials ahead. "Well," Leo said after a long pause, his voice returning to its usual sarcasm, "this should be fun. Not like we have a choice or anything." Astrid couldn't help but smile, despite the heavy weight in her chest. She knew he was trying to lighten the mood, but the seriousness of what lay ahead was still too fresh to ignore. "Let's just hope we don't destroy the whole moon," she said, her voice a little more strained than she intended. "We'll need each other for this." Leo's smile faded, and he gave her a firm nod. "I've got your back, Astrid. We're in this together. Whatever happens next, we face it as a team." "Right," Astrid replied, her voice gaining strength. She turned toward the narrow passageway that led further into the moon's depths. "Let's do this." Together, they moved forward, stepping into the unknown, their fates bound to each other and to the moon. The trials awaited, and with them, the chance to save Veritas, or watch it fall forever. Chapter 8: The Heart of Veritas. The air was different now. As Astrid and Leo ventured deeper into the moon's cavernous interior, the atmosphere grew thicker, heavier, almost as if the moon itself were holding its breath. The soft hum they had felt earlier was now a low vibration, pulsing through the walls, the floor, and even their bodies. It felt alive, responsive to their presence. They had crossed into an ancient part of Veritas, a part untouched for centuries, where the trials awaited. "You feel that?" Leo asked, his voice low and tinged with awe. "Yeah," Astrid replied, her eyes scanning the tunnel ahead, where faint bioluminescent markings lined the walls. "It's like the whole place is watching us." "Great," Leo muttered, his footsteps echoing through the cavern. "This is exactly how I pictured my last moments." Astrid shot him a sideways glance, but she couldn't entirely blame him for the nerves creeping into his tone. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became, the more palpable the pressure of the unknown. And the weight of the responsibility they carried was a constant, unyielding presence, especially now that the path to the heart of Veritas seemed so close. They reached a large, circular chamber, the walls adorned with intricate carvings of celestial bodies, moons, stars, and constellations. At the center, a stone pedestal rose from the floor, bathed in an otherworldly glow. Upon it sat a large, translucent crystal, pulsating with an inner light, casting soft shadows that danced around the room. The heart of Veritas. Astrid could feel her pulse quicken as she approached it, her heart racing. This was the culmination of everything, the answer to the power imbalance that had caused the gravity anomalies, the key to saving Veritas from destruction. But as she reached out to touch it, a sharp, resonant voice cut through the stillness. Only one may approach. Both Astrid and Leo froze, instinctively drawing closer to one another. The voice seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, reverberating with ancient authority. Only one may approach, it repeated, and only one may awaken the heart. Leo raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Guess I'm out then, huh? Let the good doctor do all the work. Astrid couldn't help but roll her eyes at his humor, but deep down, she understood the gravity of the situation. This was no joke. Whoever approached the heart, whoever attempted to harness its power, would have to sacrifice something. She could feel it in the air, a quiet but unshakable truth. The heart would not simply restore the balance, it would demand something in return. I'll go, she said quietly, the decision coming naturally, even if it scared her. You've done enough already, Leo. Leo frowned, a flicker of reluctance in his eyes. I didn't think we were going for a solo mission, you know. We're a team. Astrid met his gaze, her expression steady. And we always will be. But sometimes, we have to make choices. Sometimes, one person has to bear the weight. It's my turn. Don't go getting all noble on me now, Leo said, his voice softer than before. You're not alone in this, Astrid. Never were. She gave him a small, grateful smile before turning back to the heart. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the glowing crystal. The moment her fingers brushed its surface, the world around her seemed to blur. The air thickened, and the ground beneath her feet felt unstable. Her vision swam as though she were floating, her mind grasping for something solid. A flood of images surged into her consciousness, distant stars, collapsing galaxies, the pulse of life across 1,000 worlds. And amidst the vastness of it all, one singular truth emerged, crystal clear and undeniable: the heart of Veritas was not just a source of power, it was a conduit, a living entity intertwined with the very fabric of the moon. It was sentient, aware of every choice, every action. And now, it was offering her the chance to restore balance, but at a cost. You have come, the voice whispered, reverberating through her very being. You have awakened the heart. Now, you must decide, will you give your own energy, your own essence, to fuel the restoration of Veritas? Or will you leave the moon to its fate, to collapse into the void? Astrid's chest tightened as the weight of the decision bore down on her. She could feel the heart's power calling to her, like a gravitational pull she couldn't resist. If she chose to give herself, to sacrifice a piece of who she was, Veritas could be restored. The moon would regain its balance, and the gravitational anomalies would cease. But at what cost? Her voice faltered, uncertainty creeping in. I didn't come here for this. I didn't think I would have to give so much. But the moon, the people, the lives at stake, the voice interrupted her, a soft reassurance. You are not alone in this, Astrid. You have already shown strength, wisdom, and love. Your heart is aligned with the greater good. You will not lose yourself. Your essence will merge with the heart, and in doing so, you will become part of something much greater than yourself. Astrid felt the weight of that promise in her bones, but still, a sense of hesitation lingered. She wasn't sure if she was ready to make such a sacrifice. But as she looked back at Leo, standing just outside the chamber, a strange calm settled over her. She was not alone. No matter what happened, she had already found her purpose, and that would always be enough. I will do it, she said firmly, her hand resting on the heart. For Veritas. For the future. The moment the words left her lips, the heart flared to life, its light expanding, engulfing her in a swirling vortex of energy. She felt herself pulled into it, her body weightless, her mind connected to the very pulse of the moon. And as the power surged through her, Astrid knew that she had made the right choice. The sacrifice would be worth it, for the balance would be restored, and Veritas would survive. But as the energy enveloped her, she realized that this wasn't just a final moment, it was the beginning of something far greater than she could have ever imagined, for she had become one with the heart of Veritas. And in doing so, she had not only saved the moon. Chapter 9, The Aftermath. The moment the heart of Veritas consumed her, Astrid felt herself slip into a strange, ethereal state, like floating in the vastness of space, weightless and free, yet tethered to something far greater than herself. Her body seemed to dissolve, every cell vibrating with an energy that was not her own. She could feel the heart's pulse, its ancient rhythm syncing with her heartbeat, its power flowing through her veins, intertwining with her very essence. For a long while, there was nothing but light and sound, whispers, vibrations, distant stars. It felt as if time had ceased to exist, and she was no longer a singular being. She was a part of everything, the moon, the stars, the galaxies beyond. The pulse of life, the essence of Veritas itself, flowed through her, its power and wisdom filling her mind. It was overwhelming, yet deeply peaceful, and then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. Astrid opened her eyes. She was standing, or rather, floating in the heart of a vast chamber made of shimmering light, the same stone pedestal before her now empty. The heart of Veritas had faded into the ether, leaving behind only the faintest traces of its glow. But she could feel its presence in every corner of the moon, its pulse resonating deep within the core of Veritas. "Is it done?" she whispered, her voice breaking the silence. For a moment, there was no answer. But then, a figure stepped from the shadows, Leo, his face etched with concern, yet relief shining in his eyes. He hadn't left. "You're here," Astrid said, a soft smile tugging at her lips. She hadn't realized how much she had needed him until now. Leo walked toward her, his footsteps echoing in the hollow chamber. He looked at her, his eyes filled with awe, disbelief, and something softer, something she couldn't quite name. "I never thought I'd see the day when you'd become one with the moon. Guess I owe you an apology for doubting your whole save the planet thing." Astrid laughed, the sound filling the space around them, but there was a weariness in her voice that hadn't been there before. "I didn't exactly think I'd be saving the day by merging with a celestial body either. But here we are." Leo's gaze softened, and for a moment, the world seemed to still around them. He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch grounding her in this strange, surreal moment. "You did it," he said quietly. "You saved Veritas." She nodded, her hand tightening around his. "I think we saved it, Leo. It wasn't just me." They stood there for a while, not speaking, just feeling the steady hum of energy surrounding them, knowing that the balance had been restored. The gravitational anomalies, the disturbances that had plagued Veritas for so long, were fading into the background. The moon was stabilizing, and the people who had relied on them were going to be okay, but as the weight of it all began to settle over her, Astrid couldn't help but feel a pang of loss. The process had been all-consuming, both a sacrifice and a gift. She had merged with the heart of Veritas, becoming something more, something different. And though she had saved the moon, she wasn't sure what had been left of her. "How do you feel?" Leo asked, his voice gentle, as if afraid to disturb her thoughts. Astrid closed her eyes, focusing on the strange stillness within her. "I'm different," she admitted. "Like a part of me is still out there, with the heart. But also, like I'm here, fully myself, somehow more grounded than ever." "You're still you," Leo said, his voice steady, but with a touch of tenderness that she hadn't expected. "Maybe a little more, cosmic, but still you." Astrid chuckled softly, her heart lightening with his words. "Cosmic, huh? Yeah, I guess that's one way to put it." For the first time since they'd entered the heart's chamber, Astrid allowed herself to truly relax. She leaned against Leo, letting his presence anchor her in the moment. The world felt different now, the weight of their mission lifting, replaced by something new, a sense of peace, of purpose fulfilled. But the silence stretched on, and as the hum of the heart faded, she realized something: the mission wasn't truly over. Veritas had been saved, yes, but there was still the question of what came next for them. What came next for her? "Leo," she said softly, her voice uncertain for the first time in a while. "What happens now?" Leo's hand on her shoulder tightened, a reassuring gesture that spoke volumes. "I think now we figure it out. Together." Astrid looked up at him, his gaze unwavering, his eyes full of something deeper than friendship, deeper than gratitude. She hadn't expected it, but the realization came crashing down on her, undeniable: she wasn't just part of Veritas anymore. She was part of something bigger. Something that involved not just the moon, but the future they were going to build together. With the power of the heart of Veritas still pulsing faintly within her, Astrid understood what she had always known deep down: love, in all its forms, was the greatest force in the universe. It transcended gravity, time, space, and even the very fabric of the cosmos itself. And maybe, just maybe, the most improbable love stories were the ones that defied the laws of physics. "Together," she repeated, her heart swelling with a newfound certainty. "Yeah. Together." As they stood there, the moon stable once more, the stars outside the cavernous chamber shining brighter than ever before, Astrid knew that the journey they had started wasn't over, it had only just begun. They had saved Veritas. They had saved each other. And now, there was only one thing left to do: explore the infinite possibilities of the universe, side by side. That in the end, the gravity of their bond was stronger than anything they had ever imagined. Chapter 10: the gravity of US. The days that followed their victory felt like a slow, dreamlike descent from the heights of chaos into a quiet, unspoken calm. Astrid stood by the observation deck, watching the stars drift by, her fingers tracing the glass that separated her from the boundless expanse of space. She couldn't help but smile. It had taken everything to save Veritas, but the weight of it all seemed to have lifted from her shoulders, replaced with something entirely different, an overwhelming sense of possibility. The heart of Veritas still pulsed faintly within her, a reminder of the incredible journey she had been on, but more than that, it was a connection she would never truly sever. The gravity of that power, of her place in the cosmos, had changed her forever. And yet, in all of it, she had found something unexpected, something that had made every trial, every sacrifice, worth it. She wasn't just a pilot, not anymore, she wasn't just a scientist either, she was something else entirely, a bridge between the impossible and the tangible. And standing beside her, Leo had become just as much a part of her story as she had of his. Behind her, Leo stepped into the room, his voice cutting through the silence like the hum of a familiar melody. "You're staring at the stars again. You know, there's a whole universe out there, and you've only just begun." Astrid turned to face him, her heart unexpectedly racing. His easy grin was back, the one she had come to rely on, and in his eyes, there was a glimmer of something more than just affection, something deeper, more rooted. It was the same look he had given her before everything changed, but now, it felt like it belonged to both of them. "Yeah," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking about that. About how far we've come, and how far we still have to go." Leo leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his gaze softening. "You know, I've never been much for the future. Always lived in the moment, chasing the next thrill, the next big adventure. But with you." He paused, eyes narrowing playfully as he stepped closer. "I think I'm finally starting to see the appeal of a long haul." Astrid smiled, the weight of her emotions finally making sense. "A long haul, huh?" "Yeah," he said, voice a little more serious now. "A long haul. I mean, you've saved a planet, stopped a gravitational disaster, and still managed to look amazing doing it. I'm starting to think that maybe I could get used to this." She arched an eyebrow, heart swelling at his words. "Starting to think you could get used to me, Leo?" He chuckled, pushing off the doorframe. "Oh, I've been used to you for a while now. Maybe not in the way I'd expected, but I'm definitely here for it." Astrid's breath caught in her throat. The words they'd exchanged during their perilous journey had been charged with something neither of them had expected, something they hadn't quite understood, but it had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. Something undeniable. Something real. In that moment, standing there in the vastness of space with Leo by her side, she knew that everything had shifted. The dangers of Veritas were behind them, but there was something else they had to navigate now, the gravity of their bond. She could feel it in the way his gaze never wavered, in the silent understanding that hung between them, stronger than anything they had ever encountered. "I think I'm starting to understand," Astrid said, her voice steady but full of wonder. "I think I'm starting to see what all of this means. The moon. The stars. You and me." She took a step toward him, her hand instinctively reaching out. It's all been leading to this, hasn't it? Us. Together. Leo stepped forward, taking her hand, his touch grounding her in the moment. You've always been part of the story, Astrid. I just didn't know it until now. Their fingers intertwined, a silent promise passing between them. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was just another form of communication, one they had mastered during their time together on Veritas. They didn't need words anymore. I guess we've both learned something, haven't we? Astrid murmured, her thumb lightly brushing over his knuckles. Leo's eyes sparkled with something mischievous. That even gravity can't keep us apart. She laughed softly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of everything seemed to fall away. There was no looming disaster, no battle against fate. It was just the two of them, in the stillness of space, with a future wide open before them. Exactly, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. Even gravity can't keep us apart. They stood there, side by side, looking out at the stars, stars that had once seemed so distant, so unreachable. But now, with Leo by her side, the universe felt more like home than it ever had before. They had been through more than most people could ever imagine, and yet, here they were, standing together in the aftermath of it all. I think this might just be the start of something, Astrid whispered, her eyes locked on the horizon, where the stars stretched out in every direction. Something that's bigger than both of us. Leo squeezed her hand. Yeah. But I'm ready for it, if you are. Astrid smiled, her heart full in a way it had never been before. I'm ready. With you. And so, as the stars shone brightly overhead and the soft hum of the space station filled the air around them, they knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The journey had brought them to this moment, to this love that defied all the laws of physics, and there was no force in the universe strong enough to pull them apart. Together, they would chart a course for the future, one star at a time. And as the ship's engines hummed to life, they began their next adventure, not as separate forces, but as one.